Well, it's been a while since we've had a situation like this, but this is one of those rare cases in 10 Years Later where I'm actually going to be talking about an album that I previously reviewed back on my blog. As we move further into this series, that's going to become more common, but regardless, when it comes to early 2010s albums, that's a little bit rare. So this ought to be fun. Welcome back to 10 Years Later, the series where I talk about albums from the 2010s that were either impactful to me, impactful to music in general, very popular, or just worth revisiting 10 years later for good or bad reasons. And as you can tell by the title, the album that we will be talking about today is the 2010 Bruno Mars album, Doo-Wops Hooligans. We all know Bruno Mars at this point. He has been one of the biggest stars in pop music over the last decade, and this right here was actually his debut studio album. Just before this album's release though, Bruno's name had been buzzing pretty heavily thanks to his feature appearances on tracks like Nothin On You with B.o.B and Billionaire with Travie McCoy, the former of which made it to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. These huge appearances would set the tone for Bruno's solo music when he started to release the first big singles from this album. Tracks like Just the Way You Are and Grenade would go on to reach #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, firmly establishing the hype surrounding Bruno Mars. Interestingly enough though, as Bruno Mars recently pointed out on his Instagram, this album was initially considered a flop when it first came out. Initially it seemed that the first week sales were pretty low and many people were considering it a financial disappointment. As it would turn out though, the album became an example of what happens when you remember that records exist past their first week. And it went on to sell 14 million copies worldwide while supposedly being the longest charting debut album on the Billboard 200. Now, I previously reviewed this album on my blog back in 2018, as I said at the beginning of this video, and I'll say for sure that I didn't consider it to be Bruno Mars' best work. I mean, how many artists can really say that their best work is their debut album? With that said though, I did enjoy this record quite a bit. It was a very different side of Bruno in my eyes, but it did still feature a number of catchy, beautiful singles that sounded as good as ever. And going back to it this time, my thoughts remain mostly the same. The album isn't Bruno's best, but it's still a great time. And one thing that this record taught me, just as Bruno's other records did, is that Bruno is an artist who doesn't need to throw a ton of tracks in your face. Many of his albums are on the shorter side, and this was no different. Doo-Wops Hooligans clocks in at 10 tracks and 35 minutes, which I believe is actually the longest of the albums that he's released. And in a music world where artists are so compelled to stuff their records with unnecessary tracks and bloat out the runtime to oblivion to get more streams, it's always refreshing when artists know themselves enough not to do that, and when they're actually willing to not waste your time and get to the good stuff. And for the most part, this album does get to the good stuff. Part of what made the album so great for me was the excellent set of singles that are still awesome to this day. Tracks like Grenade and Just the Way You Are were everywhere when I was in middle school back in 2010 and 2011, and I listened to these songs quite a bit, even if they came out at a time where I wasn't all that into pop music. It probably won't come as a surprise when I say this, but there was a point where I honestly got really tired of hearing these songs because they were so omnipresent. In fact, I actually kind of credit my desire to write album reviews and post them on my blog for helping me to actually appreciate these songs without the context of, oh my god, this song is everywhere and I'm tired of it because I've heard it so many damn times. In the case of Grenade, I appreciated the song for taking things into a more emotional direction for Bruno, given that it was his second single, and it was a great showcase of how powerful his vocals were. I feel like I haven't heard a song like this from Bruno in a long time, but this is still a good one. And yes, I'll ask the question that everyone has asked all this time, just for meme purposes: how did he know her eyes were open? Sorry, had to throw it in. Anyway, Just the Way You Are was another one that cooled on me for a while, and I said this in my review, but when I was younger, there was a good portion of time where I thought this song was a bit cheesy. And yeah, it still does sound a bit cheesy, but this is too much of a feel-good track for me. It's sweet, Bruno sounds great on it, and it is unbelievably catchy. Those were not the only singles that I really enjoyed though. Talking to the Moon was perhaps the most stripped down song on the album, which isn't surprising being that it's a ballad, something Bruno hasn't really tried in a very long time. The song is heartfelt, and Bruno sells that by coming through with some of his most catchy melodies and lovely vocals on the album. And Count on Me was a track I remember first enjoying because I heard it in a commercial. I don't remember what commercial it was, but I remember the song sticking with me for a while, and even if it was a track that cooled on me after a bit, I still found my way back to it. Yes, some might find it to be a bit too sweet, and I can't imagine Bruno doing a song this light or this acoustic ever again, but his beautiful vocals and encouraging lyrics really help sell the song. Beyond the singles, my favorite of the deep cuts was Our First Time. I've gotten way more longevity out of this than I probably should have, and more than I reasonably expected when I first heard the album for my review back in 2018. The song is a bit of a slow jam with very sex-driven lyrics and smooth vocals from Bruno. I mentioned in my original review that the song sounded sounded a bit rough and demo-esque to me. And yeah, I guess it still does, but this is another track that is just unbelievably catchy. It refuses to leave my head sometimes, and it's a song I've loved more than I could have ever thought. It's also funny to look back on because in comparison to a number of the other tracks here, this more sex-driven song was kind of weird up against a number of the other tracks here. But today, Bruno's music has become more sex-driven, at least in terms of the writing, and it's just kind of a funny transition to look at. In a way, I kind of see this as a precursor to the music Bruno has been making today, and even if he hasn't exactly done slow jams on his later albums, I kind of see this as being Bruno's Versace on the Floor or Straight Up and Down before such songs ever existed. There were a few other singles that I wasn't really quite as in love with in my original review though. Not that I didn't like them, but they just weren't as memorable to me. The Lazy song is a track that to this day Bruno himself has even admitted to hating, and honestly I wouldn't say that I hate the track, though I can kind of see where he's coming from. The song is essentially an ode to laziness. It almost sounds like he's kind of portraying a younger version of Al Bundy, and I do think Bruno kills it on the vocals and crafts a very sticky hook, but as I said before, I think the song is a little bit too laid back for my liking. I can see how the song got as big as it did, but it's far from being one of my favorite Bruno Mars songs, even if some of the lyrics got a chuckle out of me. Though Marry You, while I didn't love it at first, did grow on me a lot when I revisited the album. Even if the song feels a bit openly dumb, with Bruno admitting on it that marrying this person that he's talking about is a dumb idea and they could very easily break up the next day, I just love the sweet vibe of the instrumental, and Bruno's chorus is way catchier than I had previously thought. At the time, with the song being inspired by 60s pop, I was only able to merely appreciate that Bruno was calling back to an older style of music, but now that I got to give it another listen, I quite like it. As far as deep cuts that I wasn't as in love with, the song Runaway Baby was the one I pegged as my least favorite in my original review. Listening to it now, I don't think the song has clicked with me any more than it did then. The faster rock vibes are great, and vocally Bruno proved that he was game for a song like this, but it's not quite as catchy as some of the other tracks here, and as far as the writing goes, I don't think Bruno's lyrics where he's telling a girl to stay away from him are all that compelling. Still, if nothing else, I think it's only my least favorite on the album if I really had to pick one, because it's still a pretty listenable track. Then there was Liquor Store Blues, one of the rare Bruno songs that had a feature on it, this one being Damian Marley. This is also an interesting track to me as it came at a time where Bruno was still experimenting with reggae music. And while it's still not a favorite of mine, I do think it was a valiant effort for Bruno to experiment like this, though I think he definitely did the reggae sound better with Show Me on his next album. His vocals are solid, though the song could have used a better chorus, and Damian Marley does come through with some charisma on his verse. Also, the song unironically uses air horn sounds, which is honestly kind of funny. And to close out the album, we have The Other Side, which in terms of features, I don't think anything screams 2010 more than a Bruno Mars song featuring CeeLo Green and B.o.B. When I first heard the song, I thought it was fine, but not one of my favorites, and that holds up today. I think the somewhat glossy instrumental is fine, and all of the performances on the song are great. As I said before, CeeLo Green is a big highlight for me, but this is another track that really could have used a better chorus. It's not extremely catchy or memorable, and it doesn't stand out as much, but it's still not a bad ending to the album, I'd say. Overall, I think Bruno Mars' debut album still holds up to this day. Obviously, being a debut album, it's a little rough around the edges, and Bruno himself may not have been too sure of his direction on the project, but he still consistently proves to be an excellent vocalist even on the album's worst tracks. And even though the production is a bit simpler and lighter, far from the throwback jams that we would hear on his next albums, they're still nice on the ears, and Bruno sells them pretty well. Like many will tell you, I would take Bruno's next two albums over this, and I can see that there are moments on this project where it feels like they were just trying to sell Bruno as a standard pop artist, but for the most part, the big singles on this thing still sound as good today as they did back in 2010. If nothing else, it's worth a listen just to see what Bruno sounded like when he was first starting out, and to hear what I'd say is a more innocent side of Bruno in some cases. He's grown a lot since this, but I still think he did a nice enough job with this project. Back in 2010, I enjoyed a fair few of the big singles Bruno put out, far more than I had enjoyed most pop music at the time, though as I mentioned, I did get burnt out by them a little quickly, so I'm not sure if I would have loved this album at the time. When I reviewed this in 2018, I gave it a good rating, and revisiting it this time, I'd say that rating still stands in that it's a good album. It might not have the impact of Unorthodox Jukebox or 24 Karat Magic to me, but it's still a nice listen, and many of the biggest tracks from the album are still just as good as ever. But that's just my opinion on this album. What did you guys think about it? I'm sure many of you have listened to it by this point, and if you haven't, I'm sure you've heard some of the biggest singles from it. So did you love it back in 2010? Did you hate it back in 2010? Do you love it now? Hate it now? Are you just completely indifferent to Bruno Mars? And what is your favorite of Bruno's albums? Whatever your thoughts are, whatever experiences you have with the album, leave them down in the comments. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe, thank you. If not, it's no big deal. I totally understand. In terms of what's next for 10 years later, the next album that I'm going to be talking about on this series is Taylor Swift's Speak Now. As I mentioned though, that album celebrates its 10th anniversary late in the month, but I might make my video on it a little bit earlier because with all the November albums I have to talk about, I'm going to try to start doing these videos a little bit before the 10th anniversary of the albums, just so that I'm not crunching and then I'm not stressing out too much about upcoming videos. I want to be able to give myself enough time to make them and not have to make 2 or 3 videos in the span of 1 week, or have to make 2 in 1 10 years later videos, because I don't really want to do that. So stay tuned for that, but until next time, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.